On the morning of October 14th, 1913, in a small mining village tucked into the valleys of South Wales, 439 men went underground and never came back up. Their names were recorded in a ledger. Their wages were tallied in a company book. Their deaths, when they came, were valued by a British court at exactly £24. £24. That was the fine handed to the colliery owner after the worst mining disaster in the history of the United Kingdom. Less than a shilling per dead man. Less than the cost of a decent suit. This is the story of Senghenydd. It is a story about coal and about the men who dug it out of the earth with their bare hands. It is a story about a valley that burned and a community that was shattered in a single Tuesday morning. But more than anything, it is a story about power, about who had it, who didn't, and what happened when the people who ran the mines decided that the lives of working men were simply a line item in a balance sheet. Because the Senghenydd disaster was not an accident, not entirely, not in the way that word is usually meant. The warnings had been there for years. The danger had been documented, reported, flagged, and ignored. Men had died at this very same mine 12 years before the big explosion, and the lessons from those deaths had been buried just as surely as the men themselves. By 1913, the Universal Colliery at Senghenydd was one of the most productive coal mines in Wales. It was also, by almost any measure, one of the most dangerous places on earth to work. The people who ran it knew that. They chose to keep digging anyway. To understand what happened on that Tuesday morning in October, you have to understand the world that produced it. You have to go back further than 1913, further even than the first time this particular patch of Welsh earth gave up its dead. You have to go back to the beginning, to the moment when the Industrial Revolution looked at the valleys of South Wales and decided they would never be the same again. And before you go back, you have to sit with the number for a moment. 439. Say it slowly. Try to assign a face to it, a name to it, a family to it. You cannot do it. The human mind is not built to grieve at that scale all at once. It retreats into abstraction. It says hundreds and moves on. But the people who lived in Senghenydd in October 1913 could not retreat into abstraction. For them, the number was not a statistic. It was a neighbor, a brother, a husband, a father, a son. It was the man who walked down their terrace street every morning at the same time. It was the boy who had started underground only 3 months before. Every single one of those 439 was specific, particular, irreplaceable. And that is how they must be understood if this story is to mean anything at all. South Wales in the early 19th century was not the coal country people imagine when they picture it today. The valleys were green, the rivers ran clear. Farming communities had worked the hillsides for generations, and the rhythms of life there were tied to seasons and harvests, not to shift bells and mine cages. The coal was there, of course. It had always been there, compressed into the rock over hundreds of millions of years, waiting. But no one had yet figured out how to reach it fast enough, or deep enough, to change the landscape entirely. That changed with the railways. When the rail lines began threading through the Welsh valleys in the 1840s and 1850s, they did not just bring faster travel. They brought industrialists, they brought capital, they brought the ability to move enormous quantities of coal from deep underground to the ports at Cardiff and Newport and Barry, where it could be loaded onto ships and sent to power the furnaces and factories and navies of the British Empire and beyond. The steam coal found in the South Wales coalfield was among the finest in the world for producing high heat with low smoke. The Royal Navy wanted it. The merchant fleets wanted it. The industrial cities of Britain wanted it. And so the valley floors and hillsides that had once grown crops began growing something else entirely. Pitheads, engine houses, terraced rows of workers' cottages stacked against the valley walls like shelves in a library. The speed of this transformation was disorienting, even to the people living through it. A valley that had supported a few hundred farming families in 1840 might be home to 10 or 15,000 people by 1900, the majority of them employed in or dependent on the coal industry. Towns grew without plans. Housing was built quickly and cheaply by colliery companies and private landlords who understood that the workers had nowhere else to go. The terraced houses that climbed the valley slopes in tight rows were functional, practical, and in many cases barely adequate. They were built close together because land in the valley floors was scarce and because close proximity served the purposes of a workforce that needed to be near the pit head. They looked out onto each other across narrow streets, and the people who lived in them knew each other's business in the way that people do when walls are thin and distances are short. The Rhymney Valley, where Senghenydd sat, was transformed faster than almost anywhere else. The village itself barely existed before the coal. It grew up around the mine, not the other way around. By the 1890s, when the Universal Colliery was sinking its first shafts, the village was essentially a company settlement. The men who moved there because the pit was there. Their wives and children and neighbours and church communities all existed in orbit around the colliery. When the pit bell rang in the morning, the village emptied of men. When the cage came back up, the village filled again. This was the world of the South Wales miner at the turn of the 20th century. It was not a gentle world. The work underground was brutal in ways that are almost impossible to convey to anyone who has not done it. The tunnels, or roadways as they were called, could be as narrow as 3 feet in places. Men worked in postures that destroyed their backs and knees over years of labour. The dust was everywhere, coating lungs and eyes and clothes, turning skin to permanent grey. The darkness underground was absolute when your lamp went out, and always there was the gas. There was also the water. South Wales mines were notorious for their wetness. Water seeped through fissures and joints in the rock, pooled in low sections of roadway, dripped from tunnel roofs onto men working below. A miner might spend his entire 8-hour shift with wet feet, crouching in tunnels where the roof was low enough that he could not stand upright, swinging a mandrel in a space too cramped for a full arm's extension. He would do this 6 days a week. He would do it for his entire working life, which might begin at 13 or 14 years of age and end at 60 if his body lasted that long, which many bodies did not. The physical toll of a lifetime of underground labour was written on the bodies of older miners in ways that were visible to anyone who looked. The bent backs and damaged knees were obvious. The black spots on the skin where coal dust had been ground in by old injuries were common, but the most insidious damage was internal. Coal dust breathed over years accumulated in the lungs, hardening the tissue in a process that the miners called being chested, what we now know as pneumoconiosis, or black lung disease. A miner who survived the explosive hazards of his working life might still spend his final years struggling to draw breath, dying slowly of a disease acquired in the dark underground long before anyone had thought to give it a clinical name. Coal seams produce methane as a natural byproduct of the pressures and chemistry that created them. In the language of the miners, this gas was called fire damp. It was colourless and odourless, which meant you could not see it or smell it until your lamp flame changed colour, or a test showed concentration levels climbing. In sufficient quantities, mixed with the right amount of air, fire damp was violently explosive. A spark, a naked flame, a friction point from a piece of machinery, and the gas could ignite in a wave of fire that moved faster than any human being could run. The other killer was coal dust. Finely ground coal particles suspended in mine air could, when triggered by a primary explosion, create secondary blasts that traveled for miles through the underground roadways, incinerating everything in their path. The combination of fire damp ignition and coal dust propagation was, by 1913, well understood by mining engineers and safety inspectors. The technology to combat it was also understood. Water suppression, stone dust applied to roadways to dilute and neutralize the coal dust, adequate ventilation systems, careful management of electrical and mechanical ignition sources. All of it was known. None of it was particularly cheap. This was the world into which the Universal Colliery was born. The company that owned and operated the Universal Colliery was the Lewis Merthyr Consolidated Collieries, a business concern whose leadership included men who were, by the standards of their era, considered respectable pillars of industry. The managing director through the critical period leading up to 1913 was a man named Edward Shaw. Shaw was not some shadowy villain hiding in a counting house far from the consequences of his decisions. He was a visible, prominent figure in the coal industry. He knew the mines, he knew the risks, and he made choices. The first major disaster at Senghenydd came in 1901. On May the 24th of that year, an explosion tore through one section of the Universal Colliery and killed 81 men and boys. 81. In a village the size of Senghenydd, that was a wound that reached into almost every household. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, gone in a single morning. The inquiry that followed the 1901 disaster identified the cause clearly enough: fire damp ignition, propagated by coal dust. The investigators noted specific deficiencies in the mine's ventilation and safety practices. They made recommendations. These recommendations were not legally binding. They were not followed with anything approaching the urgency the situation demanded. The families of the 81 men who died in 1901 received compensation that was, by any humane standard, inadequate. The legal framework for compensation at the time was a patchwork of workmen's compensation provisions that had only recently been introduced, and navigating those provisions required the kind of legal knowledge that most mining families did not possess and could not afford to acquire. The company contributed to a relief fund that provided some immediate assistance, as companies typically did in the wake of disasters that attracted public attention. But the structural circumstances of the families, the loss of a wage earner in a community with limited alternative employment, the ongoing need to feed and clothe and house children without the incomes that had previously supported them, these circumstances were not addressed by a relief fund or a one-time compensation payment. They were ongoing, grinding, material hardships that reshaped the lives of the widows and orphans of 1901 in ways that lasted for decades. Some of those widows remarried men who also worked in the mine. Some of those orphan children grew up to go underground themselves, because the pit was what the valley offered. The mine that had killed their fathers employed them as teenagers, and they went to work in it because there was nothing else, and because the generations before them had always gone underground, and because the alternative was leaving the valley and leaving everything they knew, which was not really an alternative at all for most of them. The men who could have forced compliance, the mine inspectors employed under the Coal Mines Regulation Act, were stretched impossibly thin across a coalfield that was expanding every year. One inspector might be responsible for dozens of collieries across a wide geographical area. The inspection regime was, in practice, a system built to document problems rather than prevent them. The reports went into files. The colliery owners paid small fines when they were found in violation, and the mines kept operating. In the 12 years between 1901 and 1913, the Universal Colliery grew substantially. New shafts were sunk, new levels were opened, new roadways were cut deeper into the mountain. The workforce expanded. At its peak, the colliery was employing over 900 men and boys on any given working day. The coal it produced was some of the finest steam coal in Wales, prized by customers across Europe and beyond. During those 12 years, various mine inspectors and their deputies visited the Universal Colliery on multiple occasions. Reports were written, concerns were raised. Specific issues with the ventilation of certain sections of the mine were noted. The management of fire damp accumulations in deeper workings was flagged as a concern. The adequacy of the reversal mechanism for the mine's ventilation fans, a critical safety feature that would allow the direction of airflow to be switched in the event of a fire, was questioned. This last point was particularly important, and it would prove devastating on October 14, 1913. A mine ventilation system works essentially like the lungs of the underground world. Air is drawn in through one shaft and exhausted through another by large mechanical fans, creating a continuous flow through the roadways and working faces. In the event of a fire or explosion underground, the direction of that airflow could mean the difference between rescuers being able to reach survivors and being blocked by smoke and fire. Reversing the fans could redirect airflow, clear smoke from certain roadways, give rescue parties a path to trapped men. At the Universal Colliery, the reversal mechanism was known to be unreliable. This had been identified in inspection reports. The management had been aware of it. Nothing effective had been done. On the morning of October 14, 1913, the men working the first shift at the Universal Colliery went underground through the Lancaster shaft in the usual way. The cage dropped them into the dark in groups, shift after shift, the familiar routine of a working colliery morning. Down on the lower levels, the face workers and the hauliers and the road repairers took up their positions. Boys who were barely teenagers dragged trams of coal through low tunnels. Men who had worked in this mine for 20 years settled into the rhythms of labor they had known all their adult lives. At 5:10 in the morning, the mine exploded. The precise cause of the initial ignition was never definitively established, though the most accepted explanation is that an electrical spark from signaling equipment triggered a pocket of fire damp. What followed the initial ignition was a catastrophe compounded by the very factors that inspectors and engineers had warned about for years. The coal dust in the roadways, thick and dry and pervasive, caught the explosion and amplified it, sending a wall of fire racing through the underground workings at terrifying speed. Men working hundreds of yards from the initial ignition point were killed by the pressure wave and the fireball before they had any chance to respond, before they even had time to understand what was happening. The fire traveled through the mine's ventilation system, following the airflow paths through the network of roadways, reaching sections of the workings that would otherwise have been relatively remote from the original explosion site. Above ground, the disaster announced itself with a column of dust and debris erupting from the pit head, followed almost immediately by smoke. The men and boys on the surface understood at once what had happened. The cage operators and the banksmen and the surface workers all knew. They had known men who died in 1901. Some of them had lost fathers or brothers in that disaster. The sight of smoke rising from the shaft told them everything. Within minutes, the pit head was crowded. Women ran from the terraced houses on the hillside. Mothers who had sent their husbands and sons underground that morning. Wives who had packed the snap tins the night before. Sisters, daughters, neighbors. They gathered at the pit head in the cold October morning air, and they waited, and the smoke kept coming. The noise at the pit head in those first hours was something that the survivors who described it afterward struggled to find language for. There was the mechanical noise of the rescue operation, the cage machinery, the ventilation equipment, the voices of the men coordinating the response. But underneath all of that was a human sound that does not have a precise name in English. It was the sound of people waiting to find out whether the people they loved were alive. It was not quite crying, though there was crying. It was not quite silence, though there were long moments of terrible stillness. It was the sound of a community suspended between the world it had woken up in and the world it was going to have to live in from this point forward, and not yet knowing which dead it would have to carry. The rescue response at Senghenydd on October 14, 1913, is a story of extraordinary personal courage, set against a backdrop of profound systemic failure. Individual men, many of them miners themselves, volunteered to go back underground into a burning mine in an attempt to reach their workmates. The first rescue parties descended within an hour of the explosion. They went in without breathing apparatus initially, driven by the knowledge that every minute mattered, that men might be alive in pockets of the workings that had been protected from the worst of the blast, that the difference between a rescue and a recovery might be measured in the speed of their response. Some of the men who went in those first rescue parties did not come back out. The conditions underground were extremely dangerous. Carbon monoxide, the odorless afterdamp produced by a mine fire, was present at concentrations that could incapacitate a man within minutes without warning. The tunnels were filled with smoke, some were partially collapsed, and the ongoing fire in deeper sections of the mine created unpredictable conditions for anyone moving through the workings. Rescue teams from other collieries in the valley arrived within hours, equipped with the breathing apparatus that had been developed in the years since the 1901 disaster. The apparatus, a self-contained breathing system that allowed rescuers to work in irrespirable atmospheres, was still relatively new technology in 1913, and working in it required training and physical fitness. The men who wore it and went back underground that day were not performing a calculated risk assessment. They were going into a mine that had just killed hundreds of their fellow miners, because the possibility that someone might still be alive was not something they could face doing nothing about. The ventilation problem that had been flagged in previous inspection reports was now a killing factor in real time. Attempts to reverse the fan direction to clear smoke from certain roadways and create rescue paths were hampered by the very mechanical unreliability that had been documented and left unaddressed. The smoke and fire control underground was far more difficult than it should have been, and this cost time. In a mine where men were trapped, time was everything. The rescue effort continued for days. In the hours immediately following the explosion, some survivors were brought out from workings that had been relatively protected. But as the scale of the disaster became clear, as the casualty count rose and the hope of finding more men alive began to fade, the nature of the operation shifted. It became less a rescue and more a recovery. In total, 439 men and boys lost their lives in the Senghenydd disaster. Some were killed instantly by the explosion. Others died from carbon monoxide poisoning, the deadly afterdamp that floods underground workings in the wake of a mine fire. A significant number were never recovered at all. The deep workings where they had been trapped were sealed off, and they remain there still. 439. The number needs a moment to settle. This was not a statistic in 1913. Each one was a man or a boy with a name and a face and a family and a history. There was Edward Morgan, 41 years old, who left behind a wife and 6 children. There was John Harris, 15 years old, working his first year underground. There was Thomas Williams, who had survived the 1901 explosion and gone back to work in this same mine because it was the only work there was. There was Abraham Davies, who was due to be married the following month. There were brothers who died alongside brothers, fathers who died alongside sons, uncles alongside nephews. There were men who had migrated to Senghenydd from other parts of Wales, drawn there by the work, who had put down roots in the village over years or decades, and whose entire network of family and community was now concentrated in those terraced streets. There were men who had come from England, from Ireland, from Spain, from Italy, immigrants to the coalfield who had found work in the Universal Colliery and made Senghenydd their home. The disaster did not distinguish between the Welsh-born and the incomers. The explosion did not check your origins before it killed you. There were men who were known in their community for things beyond their work underground. A man who sang in the chapel choir with a voice that made people close their eyes. A man who was the secretary of the local Workmen's Institute and spent his evenings organizing the lending library. A man who coached the junior football team on Saturday mornings and who the boys in the village followed around the way boys follow men they admire. A man who kept a garden behind his terraced house that was the talk of the neighborhood in summer. A man who was funny, genuinely funny, who could make an entire pub full of tired miners laugh on a Friday evening after a week underground. All of that was erased on October 14th, 1913. Not just the men, but everything they were and everything they would have been. The songs not sung, the books not read, the games not coached, the gardens not tended, the laughter not heard. And behind all of that, the children not fully raised, the marriages not lived out, the old age not reached, the ordinary future not had. The village of Senghenydd was home to approximately 2,000 people. Of the approximately 900 men employed at the Universal Colliery on that shift, 439 died. The arithmetic of that loss is almost incomprehensible at the scale of a small community. There was barely a household in the village untouched. Women who had been wives that morning were widows by afternoon. Children who had kissed their fathers goodbye were orphans before tea. The grief in Senghenydd in the days and weeks that followed was not the private grief of individual families alone. It was communal, collective, shared in a way that only close communities can share things. The terraced streets where the miners had lived became a landscape of black armbands and closed curtains. The chapels, which were central to life in these Welsh valleys, held service after service. The funerals, when the bodies could be recovered and identified, came in waves that stretched over weeks. Beyond Senghenydd, the disaster resonated across Wales and Britain. It was not the first great mining disaster in British history, nor would it be the last. But its scale made it impossible to ignore, and the questions it raised about mine safety and corporate accountability could not be entirely suppressed, even in 1913. Those questions led to an inquest and, eventually, to legal proceedings against the colliery management. The inquest into the deaths was conducted according to the legal procedures of the time, with a jury hearing evidence about the cause of the explosion and the circumstances that had led to it. The evidence that emerged painted a picture that should have been damning. The inadequacies of the ventilation system were documented. The history of previous warnings and unfollowed recommendations was laid out. The failure to adequately suppress coal dust in the roadways was established. The mechanical problems with the fan reversal system that had been known about and not properly addressed were placed before the jury. The inquest jury, after considering all of this, returned a verdict of death by misadventure, but also attached a rider to their finding. They noted specifically that the mine's management had failed in several of their obligations under the Coal Mines Act, and they identified the management's conduct as a contributing factor in the scale of the disaster. This rider, this additional finding by the jury, was important. It meant that criminal proceedings were possible. The question was what those proceedings would look like, what charges would be brought, and, most critically, what penalties would follow. Edward Shaw, the managing director of the Lewis Merthyr Consolidated Collieries and the manager of the Universal Colliery, were charged with offences under the Coal Mines Act. The prosecution case against them documented a series of violations, failures to comply with the statutory requirements of the Act in ways that had directly contributed to the deaths. The case went to trial. The evidence against the company and its management was substantial. The history of warnings ignored, safety measures not implemented, statutory requirements not met, all of it was presented. And at the end of the process, a British court handed down its judgment. Edward Shaw, whose colliery had just killed 439 human beings, was fined £24. £24. The mine manager was fined a similar trivial sum. No one went to prison. No one faced consequences remotely proportionate to the scale of the catastrophe. The fine handed to Edward Shaw was less than many working miners would earn in a single month of dangerous labour underground. It was a sum so absurd in context that it felt less like a penalty and more like a declaration that the lives of working men in the South Wales coalfields had a monetary value, and it was very, very low. The response to this verdict in the mining communities of South Wales was fury. Not surprise exactly, because the legal and political landscape of 1913 Britain was not structured in ways designed to hold coal owners to serious account, but fury nonetheless. The South Wales Miners' Federation, one of the most powerful trade union organisations in Britain at the time, condemned the judgment. Newspapers that gave voice to the labour movement treated the £24 fine as exactly the obscenity it was. The wider public response was more complicated. Disasters on this scale generated public sympathy and, for a short time, public pressure for reform. But sympathy fades. The cycle of disaster, inquiry, mild reform, and gradual return to dangerous normality was well established in British industrial history by 1913. The Senghenydd disaster fit into that cycle, and the mechanisms of that cycle ground on. The Coal Mines Act was amended in subsequent years. Safety provisions were tightened. The inspection regime, though still inadequate by the standards we would recognize today, was given somewhat more teeth. These reforms mattered in incremental ways. They saved some lives over the following decades, but they came too late for the 439 men of Senghenydd, and they did not fundamentally alter the relationship between the coal owners and the miners, a relationship built on the premise that coal was more important than the people who dug it. To understand why the legal response to the Senghenydd disaster was so inadequate, you have to understand something about the political economy of coal in Edwardian Britain. The coalfields of South Wales were not just an economic resource. They were a strategic one. The steam coal from these valleys powered the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy was the instrument of British imperial power across the world. The coal owners were, in a very real sense, men whose industry was considered essential to national security and national prosperity. They were also, in many cases, men with direct political connections. Coal owners sat in Parliament. They sat on county councils and local authorities. They were donors to political parties and personal acquaintances of the men who made the laws and appointed the judges. The system was not simply corrupt in a crude transactional sense. It was a system in which the interest of coal capital was structurally embedded in the machinery of governance in ways that made serious accountability nearly impossible to achieve through legal channels alone. Consider what it actually meant to prosecute a major coal owner in 1913. The prosecution had to be brought under the Coal Mines Act, legislation that had been drafted with considerable input from the coal industry itself, and whose provisions for penalties had been calibrated to what the industry considered acceptable, rather than to what any proportionate sense of justice might require. The maximum fines available under the Act were set at levels that reflected a political judgment made by legislators, many of whom had direct financial interests in the coal industry, about how much financial pressure it was appropriate to apply to a colliery company found in violation of safety rules. The men enforcing these laws, the mine inspectors and their superiors in the government inspectorate, were officials whose careers were embedded in relationships with the industry they regulated. This did not necessarily mean corruption in a personal sense. It meant something more systemic and in some ways more intractable. It meant that the culture of regulation was one of accommodation rather than confrontation, of finding workable arrangements rather than enforcing compliance, of treating the coal owners as partners in a shared enterprise rather than as subjects of legal authority who were required to follow rules regardless of whether those rules were convenient for them. The miners who worked underground had no equivalent structural access to the levers of power. Their organizations, the trade unions, were powerful within their own domain, capable of organizing strikes and exerting industrial pressure. But industrial pressure was a different thing from political authority, and the route from the former to the latter was long and contested, and not yet fully travelled in 1913. The Labour Party, which would eventually become the political voice of the organised working class in Britain, had only won its first parliamentary seats a few years before the Senghenydd disaster. Its capacity to influence legislation and force accountability was real but still developing. This was the political landscape into which the Senghenydd disaster erupted, a landscape in which the people who had the most direct interest in serious accountability for the deaths had the least structural power to demand it, and the people who had the most structural power to provide it had the most institutional interest in ensuring that accountability remained limited. The Senghenydd disaster occurred at a particular moment in this political evolution. It came just 3 years after the Great Coal Stoppage of 1910 and 1911, when the miners of South Wales had gone on strike for months in one of the most bitter industrial conflicts the region had ever seen. The political temperature between capital and labour in the coalfields was already high. The disaster at Senghenydd poured fuel onto that fire, but the fire had not yet produced the political changes that would eventually, decades later, fundamentally transform the industry. There is a further dimension to the Senghenydd story that goes beyond the immediate disaster and its legal aftermath. It concerns what happened to the community in the years and decades that followed, and what happened to the memory of those 439 men. The First World War came less than a year after the explosion. The men of Senghenydd, the survivors, the younger brothers and nephews of the dead, the men who had been too young to go underground in October 1913, many of them went to France and Gallipoli and Mesopotamia. The war took more from the village. The accumulation of loss in a small mining community over the course of a decade, from 1913 to the end of the war, was staggering. There is something particularly brutal about the timing of the war's arrival in relation to the disaster. The community of Senghenydd had barely had time to begin processing what October 14, 1913 had done to it, when the national mobilization of 1914 reached into the valley and began pulling its surviving young men toward a different kind of catastrophe. Some of the men who had worked in the rescue operation at the Universal Colliery, who had descended into a burning mine to bring out their workmates, who had carried bodies up from the dark in the days after the explosion. These same men found themselves a year later in the trenches of the Western Front, carrying different bodies through different kinds of dark. The women of Senghenydd, who had already lost husbands and sons in the pit, now waited again for different news in a different kind of silence. The village that had already given so much was asked to give more, and it gave it, because that is what communities do when the machinery of history demands it, whether or not the demand is reasonable or the cause proportionate to the cost. The names of Senghenydd men on First World War memorials in the valley are a separate ledger of loss from the 1913 disaster, but they cannot be properly understood in isolation from it. The two events are part of a single story about a community that was used comprehensively and without adequate compensation or acknowledgement by the industrial and military systems of Edwardian and wartime Britain. The mining industry itself continued. The Universal Colliery reopened after the disaster and kept producing coal. The same mountain that had killed 439 men continued to employ the surviving men of the village because there was nothing else. The coal was the economy of Senghenydd. You could not simply choose not to dig it. The company needed workers. The workers needed wages. And so men who had pulled bodies out of the tunnels in October 1913 went back underground, sometimes weeks later, because their families needed to eat. This is perhaps the most devastating aspect of the Senghenydd story. Not just that the disaster happened, and not just that the legal response was a grotesque inadequacy, but that the structural conditions that produced the disaster remained essentially unchanged. The relationship between the coal owner and the miner, the fundamental power imbalance that allowed safety to be compromised in the name of profit, that relationship persisted. It would persist in various forms for decades more. The Universal Colliery continued operating until 1928, when it was closed due to economic factors. By that time, the coal industry in South Wales was entering the long, grinding decline that would eventually hollow out these valleys economically over the following half-century. The pithead was demolished. The physical infrastructure of the mine that had taken so many lives was removed. The mountain above Senghenydd closed over the tunnels like a wound healing. But the wound in the community did not heal in the same way. Communities that experience catastrophic loss on that scale carry it differently than the physical landscape does. The memory was kept alive in the chapels and the miners' institutes, in family stories passed down through generations, in the knowledge that the 439 men entombed in that mountain were still there, their presence a constant underground fact of the village's geography. For much of the 20th century, the Senghenydd disaster was not widely known outside Wales. It was not a story that featured prominently in British national history as it was taught or told. This absence was itself a kind of statement. The great events that shaped national memory in Britain in the early 20th century were the battles of the First World War, the great political dramas of Parliament, the stories of empire and exploration. The deaths of 439 miners in a Welsh valley and the £24 fine that followed them did not fit comfortably into a national narrative built around progress and greatness. Within Wales, the memory was different. The disaster was part of the fabric of South Walian identity in a way that crossed generations. The labour movement, the trade union tradition, the political radicalism that characterised these valleys through much of the 20th century, all of it was nourished in part by the memory of what had happened at Senghenydd and the mockery of justice that followed it. The £24 fine was not forgotten. It was cited repeatedly in arguments about workers' rights and corporate accountability, in speeches at union meetings and in columns in labour newspapers. The keeping of this memory alive across generations was not accidental. It required effort, sustained and deliberate, by people who understood that if they did not do it, nobody else would. The local historians who documented the disaster in detail, the community organisations that maintained the commemorations, the families who passed the story down through generations, who made sure that the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren knew not just that there had been a disaster, but who the dead were and what their lives had been, and what the £24 fine had meant, and what it still meant. This kind of grassroots preservation of historical memory is unglamorous work. It does not attract prizes or headlines, but it is the reason that the story of Senghenydd survived to be told at all. The nationalisation of the coal industry after the Second World War, when the mines of South Wales passed from private ownership into public hands under the new Labour government, was experienced by many in the mining communities as a partial vindication. Not a reparation for what had happened at Senghenydd. Nothing could be that, but a structural change that acknowledged what decades of private ownership had meant for the men who worked underground. The Universal Colliery was long gone by nationalisation, but the principle it represented, that the men who risked their lives underground deserved a system of ownership and accountability that took those risks seriously. That principle had been central to the labour movement's demands for generations. The anniversary of the Senghenydd disaster was commemorated in the village, but for much of the 20th century these commemorations remained largely local affairs. The wider public remained largely unaware of what had happened there in October 1913. Or, if they were aware of it in the abstract, they did not feel it with the weight that comes from genuine engagement with the specific details, the specific names, the specific human cost. That began to change in the late 20th and early 21st century, as historical memory of industrial disasters and their political context came under renewed scrutiny. Scholars, journalists, and community historians began the work of recovering and documenting what had happened at Senghenydd in fuller detail. The names of the dead were researched and compiled. The corporate and legal history was examined more critically. The question of whether the £24 fine represented not just a historical injustice, but an ongoing failure to properly reckon with what had happened, was raised with new directness. The centenary of the disaster in 2013 was the occasion for significant public attention in a way that previous anniversaries had not been. Memorial events were held in Senghenydd and across South Wales. The national media in Britain, for perhaps the first time in a sustained way, engaged with the story not just as a historical curiosity, but as a case study in corporate accountability and the valuation of working-class lives. The £24 fine was held up again as the symbol it had always been in the mining communities, but now to a national and international audience that had perhaps not heard the number before. The centenary events brought together descendants of the dead, local historians, politicians, labour movement figures, and members of the general public in a way that made the disaster visible at national scale for the first time in its 100-year history. Exhibitions were mounted, books were published, documentaries were made. The 439 names were read aloud publicly, which took a long time, as it should, as it must, if the reading of those names is to mean anything at all. The reading of names is a ritual of remembrance that exists in many cultures, and it works precisely because it is slow, because it insists on the individuality of each person named, because it refuses the abstraction of the mass casualty figure and makes you sit with the particular, the specific, the human. 439 readings, 439 moments of acknowledgement. It takes time, and that time is the point. The National Memorial to the Senghenydd disaster stands in the village today. 439 names. If you go there and stand in front of them, the scale becomes real in a way that reading numbers cannot quite achieve. You begin to count, and you realize that counting all of them would take time. That is the point. That is what those names are there to do. The memorial was decades in the making, the product of community persistence in the face of a national culture that had been slow to acknowledge what the village had lost. Its existence is a testament to the tenacity of memory in communities that refuse to let their dead be forgotten, even when forgetting would be more convenient for the larger narrative of national history. But memorials, however necessary and however moving, do not by themselves answer the questions that the Senghenydd disaster raises. Those questions are not merely historical. They reach forward into the present in ways that demand honest engagement. The fundamental question at the heart of the Senghenydd story is this. When a company has prior warning of a safety risk, when that risk has been documented and reported, when the company has the means to address it but chooses not to because doing so would reduce profitability, and when people die as a direct result of that choice, what is the appropriate social and legal response? In 1913, Britain, the answer provided by the legal system was a fine of £24. This answer was not arrived at by accident or ignorance. It was the product of a legal and political framework that treated industrial deaths as regrettable side effects of economic activity, rather than as crimes. The framework was built by people who understood what it meant for those who worked in dangerous industries, and they built it that way deliberately, because changing it would have meant acknowledging that profit had been elevated above human life, and that those who had made that choice were criminally responsible for the consequences. This is not ancient history in the sense that the underlying dynamics it describes have been fully resolved. The tension between corporate profitability and worker safety, and the legal frameworks through which that tension is managed has not simply dissolved over the past century. It has taken different forms, operated through different industries and geographies, produced different disasters with different names. But the basic architecture of the problem, the question of what a human life is worth when set against a cost-benefit calculation, remains alive and contested. Every major industrial disaster of the 20th and 21st centuries has involved some version of the question that Senghenydd poses, the question of prior knowledge, the question of what was documented and what was ignored, the question of what it would have cost to prevent the disaster, and how that cost was weighed against the cost of the disaster itself in the calculations of the people who made the decisions. The names change, the industries change, the decades change, the underlying structure of the problem, the asymmetry between those who bear the risks and those who make the decisions that create those risks. That structure persists with remarkable durability. This does not mean that nothing has changed. It has. Workplace safety law in the UK and in most developed industrial economies is immeasurably stronger than it was in 1913. The inspection regimes, though still imperfect, have real teeth. The penalties for corporate negligence that results in deaths have been substantially increased, and corporate manslaughter legislation has created legal pathways that simply did not exist in Edward Shaw's time. The health and safety culture in many industries has shifted in ways that would have been difficult to imagine in the Edwardian coalfields. These changes matter. They have saved lives and continue to save lives. But the history of these changes is in large part a history of disasters and the political pressure those disasters generated. Change has come when the gap between the death toll and the accountability has been so grotesque, so undeniable, so publicly visible, that the pressure for reform could no longer be managed through the usual mechanisms of regulatory accommodation and limited liability. Senghenydd was one of those catalysts. It did not, by itself, produce the changes that followed, but it was part of the long accumulation of evidence that forced the recognition that the existing system was not merely inadequate, but morally indefensible. The coal industry in South Wales is gone now. The last deep mine in the region closed decades ago. The valley landscapes have changed, slowly returning to a different version of themselves. The pit heads replaced by grass and community parks, and, in some places, renewable energy installations that would have seemed science fiction to the men who dug coal there a century ago. The terraced houses remain, occupied by descendants of the mining families in some cases, by people who moved in as the nature of the economy changed in others. Senghenydd is a small village today. The universal colliery shaft that the rescue teams descended into on October 14, 1913, the Lancaster shaft, is gone. The surface infrastructure, the winding gear and the engine house and the screens where the coal was sorted, all of it was dismantled when the mine closed. The mountain above the village looks, from a distance, like any other piece of Welsh upland. Green, quiet, indifferent. But 439 men are in there. They have been in there for over 100 years. Edward Shaw, the man who was fined £24 for the deaths of those 439 men, did not go to prison. He did not lose his business. He continued as a prominent figure in the coal industry. He died years later of old age, in circumstances that bore no meaningful resemblance to the circumstances in which the men who worked for him died in October 1913. This outcome, the impunity of the man at the top of the chain of responsibility, is not a footnote to the Senghenydd story. It is the story. It is what the story is about, in its deepest sense, not just the explosion, not just the grief, not just the 439 names on the memorial, but the fact that the system designed to hold power accountable for the consequences of its choices looked at all of that and handed down a fine that a wealthy man could have paid without noticing it in his accounts. The South Wales miners who demanded justice in 1913 and 1914 did not get it. The women of Senghenydd who buried their husbands and sons and brothers did not get it. The children who grew up in the shadow of that October morning, who carried the loss through their entire lives, did not get it. What they got instead was a memorial, eventually, a centenary event, eventually, recognition, eventually, from a national culture that took the better part of 100 years to properly face what had happened in that valley. Recognition matters. Memory matters. The work of historians and community activists and the descendants of the dead who kept this story alive across generations matters enormously. The 439 men of Senghenydd deserve to be known and named and mourned, and the people who have ensured that they are known and named deserve recognition for that work. But recognition is not justice. It is not the same thing as accountability. And the difference between the two is where the Senghenydd story leaves us, uncomfortable and without easy resolution. There is a particular kind of moral reckoning that societies owe to catastrophes produced by human choice rather than pure accident. The Senghenydd disaster was not a natural event. It was the product of decisions made by people who had the power to make different decisions. The decision not to fix the ventilation reversal mechanism. The decision not to adequately address the coal dust problem. The decision not to implement the safety recommendations that followed the 1901 disaster. These were choices made in offices by men in suits with full knowledge of what the alternatives were. The men underground on October 14, 1913, did not have the luxury of choice in the same way. They could not simply decide not to go underground that morning and face no consequences. The coal was what they had. The wages were what their families lived on. The system in which they operated gave them the option of working in the mine or not working at all. And not working at all was not really an option for a man with a wife and children and a household to maintain. This asymmetry of choice and consequence is the moral core of the Senghenydd story. The people who had the most control over the conditions that caused the disaster had the least direct exposure to its risks. The people who had the least control were the ones who died in it. In the centuries since October 14, 1913, workplace safety legislation in Britain and across the developed world has improved substantially. The legal frameworks for holding employers accountable for unsafe conditions, while still imperfect and still contested, are enormously more robust than what existed in 1913. Mine safety, specifically, has advanced to the point where large-scale disasters in British pits became increasingly rare in the latter decades of the 20th century before the deep mining industry effectively ended. These improvements did not happen automatically or inevitably. They happened because workers organized and demanded them. Because disasters, like Senghenydd, generated political pressure that eventually, over decades, produced legislative change. Because the labor movement and its allies in the political world fought year after year for the recognition that the people who did dangerous work deserved legal protection, commensurate with the risks they faced. The men of Senghenydd did not die so that these changes would happen. They died because a company decided that the cost of preventing their deaths was not worth paying. But their deaths and the deaths of miners like them across the coalfields of Britain were part of what drove the movement that eventually forced the changes that reduced the likelihood of similar deaths in the future. This is cold comfort, as consolations go. But it is the truth. The valley where Senghenydd sits is quiet now in ways it was not for a century of industrial activity. The coal that was extracted from beneath it across those decades, the coal that killed 439 men on a single Tuesday morning, is long since burned. It powered ships and factories and homes and was transformed into the energy that built the modern world. It is gone, dispersed into atmosphere and history. The men who dug it out are still there, in the mountain. Their names are on the memorial in the village. They are worth reading, even if it takes a while. Edward Morgan, John Harris, Thomas Williams, Abraham Davies, William Thomas, David Evans, John James, George Powell, Henry Roberts, and on and on and on for 439 names, a roll call of the dead that takes longer to read than the explosion that killed them took to happen. The village that grew up around the mine they worked in is still there. The mountain above it is still there. And the question that the Senghenydd disaster poses about what a human life is worth when set against a profit margin, and about what justice looks like when the answer given to that question is wrong, that question is still there too. It does not have a simple answer. It never did. But it demands that we keep asking it and keep looking, honestly, at the gap between the answer we have given and the answer that 439 names require. On the morning of October 14th, 1913, those men went underground into the dark in the ordinary way. They carried their lamps and their snap tins. They nodded to their workmates. They thought about ordinary things, the way people do when they go to work in the morning, when the day ahead seems like all the other days, when the mountain above them is just the mountain, solid and usual, and containing nothing they have any reason to fear beyond the usual fears. They were not heroes. They were not statistics. They were men doing their jobs in the only world they had been given access to, a world in which the coal beneath that particular piece of Welsh earth was more valuable in the calculation of those who ran the industry than the lives of the people who extracted it. That calculation was wrong. The £24 fine was an insult written in the language of law. The mountain that holds 439 men is the permanent, wordless rebuttal of everything that fine represented. Their names are on the memorial. The memorial is in the village is in the valley, and the valley, greener now than it was when the pit head stood, sits beneath the same Welsh sky that has watched over it for longer than anyone can remember, indifferent to what has happened beneath it, offering no verdict and no comfort, but bearing witness to it all the same.